They laughed at the Navy SEAL building a strange bunker on the ridge above town. Until the night a killer blizzard buried the valley, and the only door still open belonged to the man they called Crazy. High above the small mountain town of Redpine, Montana, a quiet former Navy SEAL named Caleb Walker spent months building a strange cabin no one understood. Thick walls, steel doors, hidden vents. The townspeople joked it looked like a bunker for the end of the world. They called it a fool's shelter. But Caleb wasn't building it for fear. He was preparing for the kind of storm that only people who have survived the worst can recognize. And when the Widowmaker blizzard finally roared down from the Bitterroot Mountains, the laughter in Redpine turned into something very different. Before we begin this story, tell me something in the comments. Where are you watching from today? Your city, state, or country? I love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. The town of Redpine, Montana rested quietly beneath the long shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains. It was the kind of place where people still waved from pickup trucks and left their doors unlocked at night. A single road cut through the town, lined with weathered wooden storefronts, a gas station, a diner that smelled like bacon before sunrise, and a small grocery store that everyone relied on when winter storms blocked the highway. Beyond the last row of houses, the land opened into wide cattle fields and tall forests of lodgepole pine. And above it all, on a lonely ridge overlooking the valley, stood a small cabin that had become the town's favorite joke. Every morning when the fog lifted from the valley floor, people in Redpine could see the man working on that cabin. His name was Caleb Walker. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with the quiet discipline of someone who had spent years under orders. Even from a distance, people noticed the way he moved, slow, deliberate, never wasting motion. He wore the same faded work jeans and dark jacket almost every day. His sleeves usually rolled halfway up his forearms as he hammered boards into place or carried logs across the dirt clearing. And wherever Caleb Walker went, a large German shepherd followed close behind. The dog's name was Shadow. Shadow moved with the same quiet alertness as his owner. His thick black and tan coat caught the mountain sunlight, and his amber eyes seemed to study everything around him with careful attention. He rarely barked. Most of the time, he simply sat near the porch of the cabin, watching the valley below as if guarding something important. From town, the cabin looked strange. The walls were thicker than any normal cabin. The windows were smaller too, reinforced with heavy wooden frames. A solid steel door had been installed at the front, the kind usually seen on storm shelters rather than mountain homes. Metal ventilation pipes ran along the roofline like the exhaust system of some industrial machine. And stacked beneath the porch roof were towering rows of firewood, more than any single man could possibly burn in a normal winter. People in Redpine talked about it constantly. Most of the time they laughed. One afternoon, a group of ranchers stood outside the diner, warming their hands around cups of coffee while staring up at the ridge. "Look at him," one of them said, nodding toward the distant cabin. Caleb was hauling another stack of lumber toward the structure, Shadow walking beside him like a silent shadow. "That man's building himself a fortress." Another rancher chuckled. "What's he think's coming? The apocalypse?" Laughter spread through the small group. They had been watching Caleb work for nearly a year now. Ever since he arrived in Redpine, the former Navy SEAL had spent nearly every day building and rebuilding that cabin. Some people thought he was paranoid. Others said war had scrambled his mind. Most simply decided he was strange. Down the street, inside the grocery store, Martha Cole stood behind the register and glanced through the front window toward the ridge. She had seen Caleb many times when he came into town for supplies. quiet, polite, always paying in cash. He never stayed long, and he never talked about his past. But Martha had noticed something others hadn't. The man wasn't nervous. He wasn't unstable. He was focused. And there was a difference. Still, outside the store, the laughter continued. That evening, the jokes grew louder inside Rick Dalton's bar. Rick was the loudest man in Redpine. A thick-built guy in his mid-40s with a booming voice and a habit of laughing before finishing his own stories. His bar sat near the edge of Main Street, and on most nights it was packed with ranchers and mechanics unwinding after a long day. Rick leaned against the counter with a whiskey glass in his hand. "You all see our mountain survivalist today?" he called out. Several men turned toward the window where the ridge could just be seen in the fading evening light. "Walker's still up there building his bunker," Rick said with a grin. A mechanic at one of the tables laughed. "Maybe he thinks the Russians are coming." Another man added, "Or aliens." The room erupted with laughter. Rick raised his glass. "I'm telling you, that man's waiting for the end of the world." More laughter followed. Outside, the mountain wind moved gently through the pine trees. Far above the town, Caleb Walker continued working. The sun was beginning to dip behind the Bitterroot Mountains, casting long golden light across the ridge. Caleb stood on the cabin roof, tightening bolts along one of the metal ventilation pipes. His movements were steady and precise. Shadow sat below near the porch steps, ears upright, watching the valley as the wind brushed through his fur. After a moment, Caleb climbed down from the roof and stepped onto the wooden porch. He paused there for a long moment, looking out across the land. From that ridge he could see the entire valley, the cattle pastures, the road leading into town, the smoke rising from chimneys. It looked peaceful, normal. But Caleb's gray eyes lingered on the distant northern mountains, where dark clouds were slowly gathering beyond the horizon. He had seen skies like that before, years ago, in another mountain range thousands of miles away. Shadow rose slowly and walked to his side. The dog looked toward the same distant horizon. Caleb reached down and rested his hand gently on the dog's head. "You feel it too, huh?" Shadow's ears twitched slightly. The wind carried a faint chill that hadn't been there the day before. Caleb looked back at the cabin behind him. Thick, insulated walls. Hidden air channels beneath the floor. Emergency food supplies stored beneath removable panels. A heating system designed to circulate warmth through every corner of the structure. Most people in Redpine thought he was building a fortress for himself. But Caleb knew the truth. He wasn't building it for one man. He was building it for the day when the mountains decided to remind everyone how small they really were. Shadow suddenly lifted his head and gave a low growl toward the distant ridgeline. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. Far beyond the forest, the sky had darkened another shade. Storm clouds. Still too far away for anyone in town to notice. But Caleb noticed. He watched them quietly for a long time before finally turning back toward the cabin door. Behind him, the wind began to move a little stronger through the trees. Down in Redpine, laughter continued to spill out of Rick Dalton's bar. None of them realized that somewhere beyond the mountains, far to the north, a storm was already beginning its slow journey south. And when it arrived, the people of Redpine would remember the man they once laughed at. They just didn't know it yet. Shadow followed Caleb inside the cabin as the first cold gust of evening wind rolled across the ridge. The door closed behind them with a heavy metallic thud, and the quiet cabin waited beneath the darkening sky. For now. For the storm that was coming. Inside the cabin, The wind outside sounded distant, muffled by thick timber walls and layers of insulation Caleb Walker had carefully installed over the past year. The air inside carried the scent of fresh pine boards, iron tools, and the faint warmth of the small steel stove glowing quietly in the corner. Shadow settled down beside the door, his body stretched across the wooden floorboards like a watchful guard. Even while resting, the German shepherd's ears twitched at every subtle sound outside. Caleb moved through the cabin slowly, checking things the way he always did before nightfall. The reinforced door latch, the vents along the ceiling, the stove's airflow regulator. Everything had its place, everything had its purpose. Old habits. Habits learned in places where small mistakes could cost lives. When he finished his routine, Caleb poured a small cup of coffee from a battered thermos and sat down near the window. From there, he could still see the faint glow of lights in the valley where the town of Redpine rested peacefully beneath the mountains. To anyone else, it would have looked like a quiet, safe place. But Caleb knew better. The mountains had a memory for storms, and so did he. The night deepened. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun disappeared behind the bitterroots. Frost began creeping across the cabin windows, thin crystal patterns forming along the edges of the glass. Shadow lifted his head once, watching Caleb. Then the dog slowly walked across the room and rested his chin gently against Caleb's knee. Caleb scratched behind Shadow's ears without looking down. "Yeah," he murmured softly. "I remember too." That night, sleep came the way it often did for Caleb Walker. Uneasy, shallow, and never peaceful. The first sound in his dream was wind. A deep, roaring wind howling across frozen mountains. Then came the cracking noise, the sound of snow shifting, a distant thunder that echoed through the valley of his memory. Caleb's breathing grew heavier as the dream deepened. Suddenly, the peaceful Montana cabin was gone. He was somewhere else. Another mountain. Another winter. Afghanistan. The snow there had been deeper than anyone expected. The rescue mission had already gone wrong before the avalanche began. Caleb saw the memory the way it always returned to him. Broken pieces of sound and motion. A helicopter circling above white mountains. Radio voices shouting over static. Men digging through snow with bare hands. And then the earth itself began to move. The avalanche came like a living wall. Caleb could still hear the roar of it. Snow exploding down the slope. Men shouting warnings that came too late. The impact buried everything in seconds. In the dream, Caleb was trapped again beneath crushing snow. The weight of it pressed against his chest. Cold darkness. Air running out. He tried to move, but his arms were pinned. His lungs burned as he struggled to breathe. Somewhere above him, distant voices called his name. But they sounded far away. Fading. Just like they had that day. Caleb's heart pounded violently in his chest. His breathing turned ragged. The panic returned exactly as it always did. Then suddenly, a sharp bark shattered the dream. Caleb's eyes snapped open. He jerked upright in the chair, gasping for air as if he had just surfaced from deep water. For a moment, he didn't know where he was. The cabin, the stove, the wooden walls. Reality slowly returned. Shadow stood in front of him, paws planted firmly on the floor, staring straight into Caleb's eyes. The dog had one paw resting gently against Caleb's leg. Caleb exhaled slowly, his heartbeat still racing. "Easy," he whispered hoarsely. "Easy." Shadow gave a low whine and sat down again, still watching him carefully. Caleb rubbed his face with both hands and leaned back in the chair. The clock on the wall read 3:17 a.m. Same time as most nights. The memories always came around then. He stood and walked to the small sink, splashing cold water across his face. Outside, the wind moved through the trees with a long, whispering sound. Shadow followed him quietly across the room. Caleb crouched beside the dog and rested his forehead briefly against Shadow's head. "Good boy," he murmured. "You always know." Shadow's tail thumped softly against the floor. Years earlier, Shadow had been trained as a military working dog. Explosives detection, search and rescue. But somewhere along the way, the dog had learned something else. He had learned how to pull Caleb Walker back from the edge of his own mind. Back to the present. Back to the cabin. Back to the quiet life Caleb had tried to build after the war. Caleb stood and walked to the window again. Outside, the ridge was silent beneath the starlit sky. But far in the distance, clouds had grown thicker along the northern horizon. The wind carried a sharper edge now. Shadow stepped beside him and stared out into the darkness. The dog gave another low growl. Caleb crossed his arms and studied the sky for a long time. He had learned to trust instincts shaped by years of survival training. And something about the air tonight felt wrong. Not dangerous yet, but changing. Down in Redpine, most people slept peacefully in their warm homes. They believed winter storms came and went the same way every year. They believed the mountains were predictable. Caleb Walker knew the truth. Storms didn't always give warnings. Sometimes they simply arrived. And when they did, the difference between life and death often came down to preparation. Caleb glanced once more at the cabin walls around him. Then he reached down and scratched Shadow's neck. "We're ready," he said quietly. Shadow's ears lifted. Outside, the wind strengthened slightly as it passed through the tall pine trees. High above the valley, the clouds continued drifting slowly south. And somewhere beyond those mountains, the storm kept moving closer. Morning arrived slowly over the Bitterroot Mountains. The first pale light of dawn spilled across the ridge where Caleb Walker's cabin stood, touching the frost-covered grass and the tall pines that surrounded the clearing. A thin layer of ice glittered on the wooden porch rail, and the breath of the cold mountain air hung like mist with every exhale. Shadow stepped out first. The German shepherd moved carefully across the porch, his paws silent against the boards. He paused at the edge and lifted his head, scanning the valley below. His ears twitched as he listened to the distant sounds of Redpine waking up, truck engines rumbling to life, a faraway barn door creaking open, the faint bark of another dog somewhere near town. Behind him, the cabin door opened with a low metallic click. Caleb Walker stepped outside, carrying a heavy toolbox in one hand and a steel wrench in the other. The morning air brushed against his face, cold enough to sting the skin. He breathed it in slowly. The sky looked clear, but Caleb knew skies could lie. Shadow glanced back at him, as if checking in before continuing his quiet patrol. "Go ahead," Caleb said softly. The dog trotted down the short path that circled the cabin, inspecting the perimeter the way he did every morning. Caleb set the toolbox on the porch and climbed onto a wooden ladder leaning against the side of the cabin. The metal ventilation pipe running along the roof had loosened slightly during the night's wind. He tightened the bolts carefully. The pipe wasn't just decoration. Every part of the cabin had been designed for a reason. From town, people only saw a strange structure with thick walls and metal tubes sticking out of the roof. But inside the cabin, hidden beneath the surface, was a system Caleb had spent nearly a year building. Under the floorboards ran insulated air channels that carried heat from a compact steel stove through the entire structure. The warm air traveled beneath the planks and rose through small vents along the walls, spreading heat evenly without wasting fuel. The stove itself had been custom built. Instead of a normal chimney that let most of the warmth escape, Caleb had designed a circular airflow chamber that forced heat to circulate before leaving the pipe. It burned hotter, longer, more efficiently. Below the floor, sealed compartments stored emergency supplies. Rows of metal containers held dried food, bottled water, medical kits, and thick wool blankets. Everything was labeled and arranged with quiet military precision. There was enough food to keep 20 people alive for days. But the people of Redpine didn't know that. All they saw was a strange man building something unnecessary. Down in town, the morning routine had already begun. Inside Martha Cole's grocery store, the bell above the door jingled softly as customers stepped in from the cold. The smell of fresh bread from the bakery next door drifted through the street as farmers stopped for supplies before heading out to their fields. Martha stood behind the counter, arranging canned goods when a group of ranchers walked in, laughing. "You see Walker this morning?" one of them said. "Man's still up there fixing that bunker of his." Another rancher chuckled. "Maybe he thinks winter's gonna end the world." They laughed again. Martha didn't join them. She had lived in Redpine long enough to recognize the difference between foolishness and quiet determination. And Caleb Walker didn't look like a fool to her. Back on the ridge, the sound of hammering echoed faintly through the trees as Caleb secured another layer of insulation along the cabin's outer wall. Shadow returned from his patrol and sat beside the ladder, watching Caleb work. The dog's amber eyes followed every movement. Occasionally, he looked toward the valley, then toward the distant mountains. The wind carried a faint whisper through the pines. Caleb climbed down from the ladder and wiped the grease from his hands with a rag. "Almost done," he said quietly. Shadow wagged his tail once. Caleb walked around the cabin, inspecting each section the way he did every morning. The reinforced door, the storm shutters beside the windows, the stacked rows of firewood beneath the porch roof. Each log had been placed carefully so air could move between them, keeping the wood dry even during heavy snowfall. Nearly 1,000 pounds of firewood waited there, more than enough. Shadow suddenly stopped moving. The dog's ears rose straight up. Caleb noticed immediately. "What is it?" Shadow stood perfectly still, staring toward the northern ridgeline where the mountains faded into distant blue shadows. The wind shifted slightly. A colder current slipped through the clearing. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he slowly folded his arms across his chest. The clouds from the night before were gone, but the air felt different. Sharper, thinner, like the mountains were holding their breath. Shadow gave a low growl. Not loud, just enough to say something wasn't right. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's back. "Yeah," he murmured. "I feel it too." They stood there together for several seconds, staring toward the distant north. Finally, Caleb turned back toward the cabin. Inside, the small stove continued glowing with steady warmth. The vents hummed softly as air circulated through the hidden channels beneath the floor. Everything worked exactly the way it was supposed to. He stepped onto the porch and picked up the toolbox again. Shadow followed close behind. Down in Redpine, the people continued their ordinary lives. Trucks rolled down gravel roads, children walked to school, Laughter drifted from Rick Dalton's bar as the early regulars gathered for their morning coffee. No one in town was looking at the mountains. No one except Caleb Walker and the dog beside him. Because high above the valley, beyond the first line of distant peaks, the northern sky had begun forming something new, something heavy, something slow. A wall of winter moving quietly across the wilderness. Still far away, still invisible to the town below. But Caleb Walker had seen storms like that before, and when they came, the mountains never gave second chances. Shadow glanced once more toward the horizon. Then he stepped inside the cabin and sat beside the door, waiting, just like his owner, waiting for the storm that neither of them could stop. Down in the valley, life in Redpine continued as if the mountains above it were nothing more than a quiet backdrop painted across the horizon. The afternoon sun hung low over the fields, casting long golden shadows across cattle pastures and gravel roads. Pickup trucks rolled slowly through town, tires crunching over frost-covered dirt, while thin trails of smoke drifted upward from chimneys as families lit their evening fires. The people of Redpine had lived with winter their entire lives. Storms came, storms went, and most of the time, life carried on the same way it always had. That evening, the warm glow of yellow lights spilled out from the windows of Rick Dalton's bar. Inside, the room smelled of old wood, fried onions, and the sharp bite of whiskey. A battered jukebox hummed softly in the corner, while several ranchers gathered around a wide oak table near the center of the room. Rick Dalton stood behind the counter, polishing a glass with a towel draped over his shoulder. Rick was a large man with a thick chest and a voice that could fill the entire building without effort. His sandy hair had begun thinning at the temples, but his confident grin never seemed to fade. He enjoyed being the loudest man in the room, and tonight, like most nights, he had found a reason to laugh. Rick leaned forward against the counter and nodded toward the window that faced the northern ridge. "You boys take a look up there lately?" he said. Several men turned their heads. Even through the fading evening light, the silhouette of Caleb Walker's cabin could still be seen perched on the ridge like a lonely watchtower. Rick chuckled. "That survivalist of ours is still working on that bunker." A rancher named Hank Whitmore laughed. "He's been hammering on that thing for months." Another man lifted his beer. "I drove past the trail yesterday. Man's got enough firewood stacked up there to last 10 winters. The table erupted in laughter. Rick raised his eyebrows dramatically. "Maybe he thinks the world's ending." Someone at the far end of the bar added, "Or maybe he's hiding from it." More laughter followed. The sound bounced off the wooden walls and filled the room with the careless confidence of people who believed nothing truly bad could happen in a place like Redpine. Near the window, a man sitting alone at a small table remained quiet. His name was Ethan Brooks. He had only moved to town a few weeks earlier after opening a small repair garage near the gas station. Ethan was younger than most of the ranchers, with dark hair, a square jaw, and the kind of steady gaze that came from years spent fixing machines rather than talking about them. He glanced toward the ridge through the frosted window. "Anyone ever ask him why he built it like that?" Ethan asked calmly. Rick snorted. "Ask Walker? That guy barely talks." Another rancher leaned back in his chair. "Don't need to ask. He's paranoid. Too many years in the military." Rick raised his glass again. "That's what happens when a man spends too long in war zones," he said. "He starts seeing danger where there ain't any." More laughter rolled through the room. Ethan didn't laugh. Instead, he looked out the window again. The sky above the ridge had darkened slightly. Clouds were gathering along the northern horizon. Nothing dramatic, not yet. But something about the shape of them caught his attention.
Across the room, the door to the bar opened with a creak, letting a cold gust of wind swirl across the floor. Martha Cole stepped inside, brushing snow dust from her coat. Rick waved a hand toward her. "Martha, come join the fun. We're talking about your favorite mountain hermit." Martha sighed softly. "You boys still laughing about Caleb Walker?" Rick grinned. "Why wouldn't we?" She walked toward the counter. "Because that man's the only one in this town who might actually know what he's doing." The room quieted slightly. Rick leaned his elbows on the counter. "You saying you believe all that storm shelter nonsense?" Martha met his gaze. "I'm saying men don't spend a year building something like that unless they've seen something the rest of us haven't." Rick chuckled again. "Well, if the end of the world comes, I guess we'll know where to go." The laughter returned. But Ethan Brooks didn't laugh this time either. Outside the bar, the wind had grown colder. Far above the valley, the pine trees along the ridge swayed gently as evening settled over the Bitterroot Mountains. Up there, Caleb Walker was stacking another row of firewood beneath the porch roof. Each log slid carefully into place, forming a tight wall of dry timber that would stay protected from snow. Shadow lay near the cabin steps, his eyes half closed, but his ears still alert. Every few seconds, the dog glanced toward the distant north. Caleb noticed. He always noticed.
He stepped back from the woodpile and followed Shadow's gaze. The clouds had thickened slightly, still distant, still quiet, but larger now. A long gray band stretching across the horizon. Caleb wiped his hands on his jacket and stepped onto the porch. The wind brushed across the clearing again, colder than before. Shadow rose to his feet. The German shepherd stared toward the mountains with unwavering focus. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's back. "Something's coming," he said quietly. Shadow gave a low rumble in his chest. Down in Redpine, laughter continued spilling out of Rick Dalton's bar. The jukebox played another song. Glasses clinked. Voices rose. But far above them, beyond the forested slopes and silent ridges, the northern sky had begun changing in ways most people would never notice until it was too late. The clouds were no longer drifting. They were building, slowly, patiently, like a wall rising in the distance. And the wind that followed them carried the first whisper of winter's true power. Shadow's ears twitched again. Caleb looked north one last time before stepping back inside the cabin. The heavy steel door closed with a dull, final sound. Outside, the mountain wind continued moving through the trees. Inside Rick Dalton's bar, the laughter grew louder. None of them knew that the storm forming beyond the mountains had already begun its journey toward Redpine. And when it arrived, it would erase every joke they had ever made about the man on the ridge. The next morning dawned clear and cold over the Bitterroot Mountains. A thin silver frost covered the valley floor, clinging to fence posts and frozen grass like powdered glass. The sky stretched wide and pale above Redpine, the kind of calm blue that made people believe winter would behave itself. Farmers started their trucks before sunrise. The low rumble of engines rolled across the open fields while cattle moved slowly through the morning mist. Smoke curled upward from chimneys as families brewed coffee and prepared for another ordinary day. Nothing looked unusual. Nothing looked dangerous. But high above the town, on the ridge where Caleb Walker's cabin stood, the air felt different. Sharper, colder. Shadow was the first to notice. The German shepherd stepped out onto the porch before Caleb even opened the door. His ears rose immediately, turning toward the distant northern mountains. The dog stood perfectly still, watching, listening. Caleb stepped outside moments later, pulling his jacket tighter around his shoulders. The cold bit harder than it had the day before. He followed Shadow's gaze toward the horizon. The mountains looked calm, but Caleb had learned long ago that storms often hid behind calm skies. He crouched beside the dog. "What do you hear, boy?" Shadow didn't move. A faint wind whispered through the pines. Somewhere deep in the forest, a raven called once before taking flight. Then the dog gave a low growl. Not loud, just enough to signal unease. Caleb slowly stood. The wind carried a scent that only people who spent years outdoors learned to recognize. Dry air, sharp temperature drop, and something else, pressure shifting. Caleb turned toward the cabin and walked back inside. Shadow followed immediately. Inside, the warmth of the small steel stove wrapped around the room. The vents along the walls carried the heat quietly through hidden channels beneath the floor. Caleb moved to the small workbench near the window and unfolded a weather map he had printed days earlier. A cold front had been forming across western Canada. At first, it looked like a normal winter system, but the pressure lines had begun tightening, and tightening, and tightening. Caleb ran a finger across the map. "Widowmaker pattern," he muttered. Storm systems like that didn't happen often, but when they did, they swallowed entire mountain valleys in days. He folded the map and set it aside. "All right," he said quietly. Shadow's ears twitched. Caleb stepped outside again and began working immediately. The day's routine changed. Instead of small repairs, he moved faster, purposefully. He carried 2 more armloads of firewood beneath the porch roof, checked the cabin's storm shutters, inspected the ventilation pipes again. Shadow followed him from one side of the cabin to the other like a silent assistant. Every few minutes the dog paused and stared north. The wind had begun to change direction. Down in Redpine, the town noticed smaller signs. The morning stayed colder than usual. The wind came in short, restless bursts. Birds flew lower across the valley, but no one worried. Inside Martha Cole's grocery store, customers continued their usual routines. "Cold one today," a rancher said as he placed a sack of feed on the counter. Martha nodded. "Feels like winter's moving in early." The rancher shrugged. "Montana's always early." Outside, the wind rattled the store's hanging sign slightly harder than the day before. Across the street, Rick Dalton stood outside his bar smoking a cigarette. He looked up toward the ridge briefly. The cabin sat quietly in the sunlight. Smoke drifted gently from its chimney. Rick shook his head with a small chuckle. "That guy's ready for Armageddon," he muttered. Inside the bar, Ethan Brooks sat near the window drinking coffee. He followed Rick's glance toward the mountains. The clouds on the northern horizon had thickened slightly. Still far away, still harmless looking. But Ethan had spent enough winters working roadside repairs to recognize when weather felt wrong. He watched the sky a little longer. Then he finished his coffee and stood. Back on the ridge, Caleb finished reinforcing the last of the storm shutters. The metal hinges clanked into place as he secured them along the cabin windows. Shadow paced slowly along the clearing, nose lifted to the wind. The temperature dropped another few degrees. The breeze carried small crystals of frost through the air. Caleb stepped onto the porch and wiped his hands. He looked north again. The distant clouds had grown taller, their edges darker now. and they were no longer drifting slowly. They were spreading, like ink across the sky. Shadow suddenly barked once, a sharp, warning sound. Caleb crouched beside him. "You see it too." The dog's amber eyes never left the mountains. The wind gusted again, stronger this time. Branches rustled through the forest. Caleb stood slowly and took one last look at the horizon. Then he spoke quietly. "It's coming sooner than I thought." Shadow gave another low growl. Down in Redpine, children walked home from school beneath a peaceful sky. Pickup trucks rolled down quiet roads. Rick Dalton unlocked the doors to his bar for the evening crowd. Life continued normally. But high above them, beyond the first line of distant peaks, the sky had begun building something massive, something slow, something powerful. The storm had crossed the Canadian border overnight, and now it was moving straight toward the Bitterroot Valley. Shadow stepped closer to Caleb's side. Together they stood on the porch, watching the northern horizon darken little by little. Waiting. Because Caleb Walker knew something the rest of Redpine did not. When storms like this arrived in the mountains, they did not ask permission. The day ended quietly over Redpine. For a few hours that evening, the sky looked almost peaceful again. The clouds that Caleb had watched all morning seemed to hang far away along the northern ridges, and the sun dipped beneath the Bitterroot Mountains in a calm orange glow that painted the valley with soft light. Down in town, people relaxed. Children played in front yards until their parents called them inside. The lights in Rick Dalton's bar flickered on as ranchers finished their work and gathered for dinner and drinks. Smoke drifted from chimneys, and the sound of laughter carried through the cold air. For a moment, it seemed like Caleb Walker might have been wrong. But the mountains were already changing. By late evening, the wind began to rise. At first, it was only a steady breeze sliding through the pine trees along the ridge. The branches swayed gently, and the clearing around Caleb's cabin filled with the whispering sound of needles brushing together. Shadow noticed it immediately. The German shepherd stood near the porch railing, staring into the darkness beyond the trees. His ears moved constantly, tracking every shift in the wind. Caleb stepped outside and joined him. The temperature had dropped sharply since sunset. Each breath formed a white cloud in the air. He studied the northern horizon. The sky was no longer clear. A thick wall of clouds had rolled across the mountains, swallowing the stars one by one. The moon disappeared behind the growing mass, leaving the valley beneath a deep gray shadow. Shadow gave a quiet whine. Caleb nodded slightly. "Yeah," he murmured. "I see it." He stepped back inside and closed the heavy steel door. Inside the cabin, the stove glowed brighter as Caleb added another log to the fire. The heat spread slowly through the air channels beneath the floor, warming the small structure with steady comfort. Outside, the wind grew louder. By 10 o'clock that night, it had turned sharp and restless, rattling the cabin's shutters and pushing snowflakes across the clearing. The first snow of the storm had arrived. In town, people noticed. Rick Dalton was wiping down the bar counter when a sudden gust of wind slammed against the building, hard enough to rattle the windows. "What the hell was that?" one of the ranchers asked. Rick shrugged. "Just wind." Another gust followed, stronger this time. Outside the bar windows, the streetlights flickered as snow began swirling through the air. The men glanced at each other. "Well," Rick said, pouring another drink, "looks like winter finally showed up." But within an hour, the storm grew worse. Much worse. The wind began howling through the valley with a sound that seemed almost alive. Snow fell harder, swirling in thick white sheets that quickly erased the roads and sidewalks of Redpine. By midnight, visibility had dropped to almost nothing. Inside homes across town, people fed wood into their fireplaces and waited for the storm to pass, like every other winter storm before it. But this one didn't behave like the others. The wind continued building, faster, colder. The temperature dropped rapidly. By 2 in the morning, the valley had become a blizzard. At Caleb's cabin, the reinforced shutters rattled against the storm, while snow piled against the outer walls. The wind screamed through the trees with a force that bent the tall pines almost sideways. But inside the cabin, everything remained calm. The thick timber walls held firm. The heating system continued circulating warmth through the floor and walls. Caleb sat near the stove, watching the pressure gauge mounted beside the ventilation pipe. Everything was working exactly as designed. Shadow lay beside the door, but the dog wasn't resting. His eyes remained open, following every sound outside. Suddenly, the power grid across Redpine failed. In the valley below, the lights of the town vanished all at once. The darkness spread through the storm like spilled ink. Inside Rick Dalton's bar, the music cut off instantly as the building went black. "What the?" The rest of Rick's sentence disappeared as the room fell silent. Someone struck a lighter. The small flame revealed anxious faces around the bar. "Power's out," one of the men said. Rick moved toward the window. Outside, the storm had turned violent. Snow blasted sideways through the streetlights, and the wind howled loud enough to shake the entire building. "Damn," Rick muttered. Across town, the same realization spread from house to house. Without electricity, heaters shut down. Furnaces stopped running. Families gathered closer to their fireplaces as the cold began creeping into their homes. The temperature continued falling. -10, -20, -30. Back on the ridge, Caleb stepped onto the porch for a moment despite the storm. Snow whipped across the clearing and struck his jacket like tiny needles. The wind nearly stole his breath as he stared down toward the valley. The entire town of Redpine sat in darkness. No lights, no movement. Just the faint outlines of buildings buried beneath swirling snow. Shadow stood beside him, bracing against the wind. Caleb watched the valley quietly. Then he spoke one quiet sentence. "It's worse than I thought." The storm wasn't just passing through. It had settled over the valley. And if it stayed long enough, the town below would begin freezing. Caleb stepped back inside and sealed the door again. The steel latch locked with a solid click. Shadow shook snow from his fur and returned to his place near the entrance. Outside, the blizzard raged harder. Inside the cabin, the warmth remained steady. And down in Redpine, the people who had laughed at the man on the ridge were beginning to realize something frightening. Their homes were not built for a storm like this. The blizzard swallowed the valley before dawn. Snow blasted sideways across the streets, piling against doors and windows until the town of Redpine looked like it had been buried by a white ocean. The wind howled between buildings with a deep, relentless roar that never seemed to stop. Inside their homes, people began to understand how serious the storm had become. Fireplaces struggled to keep up with the falling temperature. The wind forced icy drafts through every crack in the wooden walls. Curtains fluttered as cold air slipped through the window frames. Families huddled closer to the fire. But the warmth faded quickly. Without electricity, the heaters were silent. Without steady fuel, fireplaces burned low. And outside, the storm continued growing stronger. Inside Rick Dalton's bar, the situation had become tense. The building was one of the largest structures in town, and several people had gathered there, hoping the heavy brick walls would keep the cold out. The only light in the room came from a few candles placed along the counter and a small iron stove burning in the corner. Rick paced back and forth across the floor. The usual confidence in his voice had disappeared. "Anybody got a radio working?" he asked. A rancher near the window shook his head. "Nothing but static." The wind slammed against the side of the building again, rattling the glass hard enough to make several people jump. Across the room, a young mother sat wrapped in a blanket beside the stove. Her little boy rested against her shoulder, shivering despite the warmth of the fire. Martha Cole stood nearby, watching the flames carefully as she fed another log into the stove. "Temperature's still dropping," she said quietly. Ethan Brooks stood beside the window. The glass had frosted over so thickly that he had to wipe it with his sleeve just to see outside. The storm looked worse than anything he had ever seen. Snow covered the entire street now, burying cars and fences alike. The wind moved so violently that it created swirling walls of white that erased everything beyond a few yards. Ethan stared into the storm. Then he noticed something. Far above the town, on the ridge, a faint glow. At first he thought it was a reflection from the storm, but then the wind shifted slightly and the light appeared again. Steady, warm. The cabin. Ethan turned back toward the room. "Hey," he said quietly. The others looked up. "Look out there." Several men walked toward the window. Rick wiped the frost away with his hand and leaned close. Through the swirling snow, they could barely see the ridge, but the light was there. Caleb Walker's cabin, still glowing, still warm. For a moment, no one spoke. The realization spread slowly across the room. Their homes were freezing, but that cabin... Rick swallowed hard. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered. The rancher beside him spoke softly. "That place was built for this." The young mother near the stove tightened the blanket around her son. "He's getting colder," she whispered. The boy's lips had turned pale. The stove crackled quietly, but it wasn't enough. Ethan turned back toward the window. The wind roared louder. "We can't stay here all night," he said. Rick looked at him. "You planning on going out in that?" Ethan didn't answer immediately. He just looked toward the ridge again. The cabin light glowed through the storm like a small star. Then he spoke. "That place is the only building in this valley that might actually hold heat." Silence filled the room. Rick rubbed his hands together nervously. "You're saying we walk up there?" Martha Cole stepped forward. "Yes." Her voice was calm, firm. "The man built that place for a reason." Rick looked around the room. Several people stared back at him. None of them were laughing anymore. Another violent gust slammed against the building, making the windows shudder. Snow forced its way beneath the door. The temperature inside the bar dropped another degree. Rick finally exhaled slowly. "All right," he said. "We wait a little longer." But the storm kept getting worse. Hours passed. The wind grew louder. The cold crept deeper into the room. And the little boy by the stove began shivering uncontrollably. Martha knelt beside him and touched his forehead. "He's getting hypothermic," she said softly. That was the moment everything changed. Rick looked toward Ethan. Ethan looked toward the ridge. Neither of them needed to say it out loud. Everyone in the room already knew. The only safe place left in the valley was the cabin of the man they had mocked for months. Rick grabbed his coat. "Well," he said quietly. "Looks like we're going to pay our survivalist a visit." Outside, the storm screamed across the valley. The wind cut through the streets like a blade as a small group of people gathered near the door. Ethan pulled his hat down tightly over his ears. Martha wrapped the little boy in 2 blankets. Rick grabbed a lantern. One by one, they stepped into the blizzard. The wind hit them instantly, nearly knocking them off their feet. Snow blasted across their faces, freezing against their skin. The ridge above them was barely visible. But somewhere up there, the cabin light still burned. And if they could reach it, they might survive the coldest night Redpine had ever seen. The wind nearly shoved them back through the door the moment they stepped outside. Snow struck their faces like handfuls of frozen sand. The lantern Rick carried swung wildly in his hand, its small flame barely visible through the swirling white storm. For a moment, no one moved. The street they had walked 1,000 times looked completely different now. Buried, silent. The road leading toward the ridge had disappeared beneath drifts of snow that reached almost to their knees. Ethan stepped forward first. "Stay close!" he shouted over the wind. The storm swallowed his voice almost instantly. Behind him, Martha held the little boy tightly against her chest. The child was wrapped in blankets and barely conscious, his breath thin and shaky against the frozen air. Rick looked back at the others. "Once we start up the hill, we don't stop," he said. No one argued. Because every second they remained outside meant the cold was creeping deeper into their bones. They began walking. The wind roared down the valley like a freight train. Snow blasted across their path so violently that it erased their footprints within seconds. The ridge above them was nothing but a faint shadow behind a curtain of blowing white. Step by step, they pushed forward. The climb started gently, but the deeper they moved into the open field beyond town, the stronger the wind became. Ethan leaned forward, forcing his boots through the drifts. Rick struggled behind him, holding the lantern close to his chest to keep the flame alive. Martha followed carefully, her arms wrapped around the boy. The rest of the small group stayed close together. The storm had turned the mountain path into a maze of white. Every few seconds, the wind changed direction, blasting snow across their faces so hard it forced them to stop and turn away just to breathe. Then the first accident happened. One of the ranchers stepped forward and suddenly vanished. A shout tore through the wind. The man had slipped off the buried edge of the trail and fallen into a snow-filled ditch. Ethan lunged forward and grabbed his coat before he could slide deeper into the drift. "Careful!" Ethan yelled. It took 2 of them to pull the man back onto the path. The storm swallowed their voices again. They kept moving. The climb grew steeper. Snow now reached halfway up their legs. The wind pushed against them so hard it felt like trying to walk through water. Rick's lantern flickered violently. Then, suddenly, the light went out. The group froze. Darkness wrapped around them instantly. The storm roared louder than ever. Rick cursed under his breath and shook the lantern uselessly. "Great," he muttered. But Ethan pointed upward. Through the chaos of the storm, they could still see it. A faint golden glow. The cabin light. It burned steadily through the blizzard like a beacon guiding them up the mountain. "That way!" Ethan shouted. They pushed forward again. The wind grew colder the higher they climbed. The boy in Martha's arms began shivering violently. His small hands trembled beneath the blankets. "We have to move faster," she said. But the storm had other plans. Halfway up the ridge, the wind shifted suddenly. A blast of air slammed across the slope, sending a wave of snow tumbling down the hillside. The group staggered. Ethan dropped to one knee to keep from being knocked over. Rick grabbed Martha's arm to steady her. And in that moment, the boy slipped. The blanket slid from Martha's arms. The child tumbled backward into the deep snow. "Mason!" she cried. The wind instantly covered him in swirling white. For a terrifying moment, no one could see where he had fallen. Panic surged through the group. Ethan dropped to his knees, digging through the drift with his bare hands. "Where is he?" Martha's voice cracked with fear. I can't see him." The storm screamed louder. Snow filled their eyes and mouths. Then suddenly, a shape appeared through the white. A dark form moving swiftly across the slope, low to the ground, fast. A German shepherd burst through the storm like a shadow brought to life. Shadow. The dog moved with absolute certainty. His nose pressed into the snow as he tracked the scent beneath the drift. Within seconds, he reached the spot where the boy had fallen. Shadow began digging furiously. Snow flew in every direction as his powerful paws tore into the drift. Then he stopped. The boy's small arm appeared beneath the snow. Ethan rushed forward and lifted the child into Martha's arms. "He's breathing," Ethan said quickly. Martha collapsed to her knees with relief. But then Ethan noticed something. Shadow limped backward slightly. Dark stains spread across the white snow beneath his paw. Ice from the storm had sliced into his leg during the frantic digging. Blood dripped onto the frozen ground. "Shadow," Ethan whispered. The dog barely seemed to notice. Instead, he turned toward the ridge and barked once. A sharp command. Then he started walking again, slowly, limping, but determined. The message was clear. "Follow me." The group looked at each other in stunned silence. The dog had found the boy in the storm, and now he was leading them up the mountain. Step by painful step, Shadow guided them through the blizzard. He moved ahead of them, pausing every few yards to make sure they stayed close. The cabin light above the ridge grew brighter with every step, and for the first time since leaving town, hope returned. High above them, inside the warm cabin on the ridge, Caleb Walker stood beside the window, watching the storm, waiting, because somehow he already knew they were coming. Inside the cabin, Caleb Walker stood motionless beside the narrow window that faced the valley. Outside, the storm raged across the mountains like a living thing. Snow slammed against the thick wooden walls in waves, and the wind howled through the pines so loudly it sounded almost like distant engines roaring through the night. But inside the cabin, it was warm. Not just warm, steady, controlled. The stone hearth at the center of the room glowed with a deep orange fire that radiated heat through the thick floor and walls. The metal pipes built into the structure quietly circulated warm air through the vents hidden along the ceiling beams. The cabin had been designed for this. Caleb listened carefully. Beneath the constant roar of the blizzard, another sound slowly reached him. A faint bark. Shadow. Caleb's eyes narrowed slightly. He stepped closer to the window, wiping away a thin layer of frost that had formed along the glass. For several seconds, he saw nothing but swirling white snow. Then, shapes. Dark figures struggling up the ridge through the storm. People. Caleb let out a slow breath. "They made it," he murmured. He turned away from the window and moved calmly through the cabin. He placed more wood into the stove, checked the water tank connected to the melting snow system, pulled several thick blankets from a storage chest. By the time he reached the heavy steel door, everything was ready. Outside, the group staggered through the final stretch of snow. The slope near the cabin was the steepest part of the climb, and the wind struck them head-on like a wall of ice. Rick could barely feel his hands anymore. The cold had crept through his gloves and into his bones. Ahead of them, Shadow continued forward. The German shepherd limped badly now, his injured leg leaving faint red marks across the snow behind him. But he never stopped moving. The cabin light glowed brighter through the storm. It was so close now that they could see the outline of the roof through the blowing snow. Ethan shouted over the wind, "There!" Martha tightened her hold on the boy and forced herself forward. Her legs felt like blocks of ice, but the sight of the cabin pushed them onward. 10 more steps, then 20. The wind screamed around the structure, sending spirals of snow across the clearing. Shadow reached the door first. He barked once. A sharp, familiar sound. Inside the cabin, Caleb heard it. Without hesitation, he unlocked the steel latch. The door swung open. A blast of freezing wind and snow exploded into the warm cabin air. For a moment, the people outside simply stood there, stunned. The warmth pouring out of the doorway felt almost unreal. Caleb stood in the entrance, calm and steady. He wore a thick flannel shirt and work gloves, his posture relaxed despite the storm raging behind the group. His eyes moved slowly across their faces. Rick, Martha, Ethan, the others. None of them looked like the same people who had laughed at him in town. Their faces were pale from the cold, their eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. Caleb stepped aside. "Get inside," he said. The words were simple, but they sounded like salvation. One by one, they stumbled through the doorway. The warmth hit them instantly. Several people gasped as the heat reached their frozen skin. Rick nearly collapsed against the wall as feeling slowly returned to his hands. Martha sank into a chair near the fire, wrapping the boy in fresh blankets Caleb had laid out. The child's breathing steadied as the warmth surrounded him. Ethan stood near the door, staring around the cabin in disbelief. The place looked more like a survival bunker than a mountain home. Thick insulated walls, metal ventilation ducts, shelves filled with supplies. Everything had been carefully planned. Caleb closed the heavy steel door behind them. The wind outside became a distant roar once the latch sealed shut. Silence filled the cabin. Then Ethan spoke quietly. "You built all this? For a storm?" Caleb shrugged slightly. "For storms," he replied. Rick stared at the walls. "You knew something like this would happen?" Caleb walked to the fire and adjusted one of the vents along the floor. "I knew it could." His voice remained calm, like a man discussing something ordinary. Rick shook his head slowly. Back in town, he had called this place a fool's shelter. Now it felt like the safest building in the entire valley. Martha looked toward the door. "Shadow," she said suddenly. Caleb turned instantly. The German shepherd had collapsed just inside the entrance. The dog's injured leg was bleeding steadily onto the wooden floor. Caleb knelt beside him immediately. "Hey, partner," he said softly. Shadow wagged his tail weakly. The dog's dark eyes met Caleb's, calm and loyal despite the pain. Caleb carefully lifted the injured paw. The cut from the ice was deep but clean. "You worked too hard tonight," Caleb murmured. He reached for a small medical kit stored beneath a bench. Within minutes, he had cleaned the wound and wrapped the leg with a tight bandage. Shadow remained perfectly still during the process, watching Caleb the entire time. When Caleb finished, the dog rested his head against Caleb's arm. Rick stared at them. "That dog saved us out there," he said quietly. Caleb scratched behind Shadow's ears. "He's been saving people his whole life." The fire crackled warmly. Outside, the storm continued to rage across the mountains. But inside the cabin, the people of Redpine finally felt safe. For the first time that night, no one spoke. They simply sat in the warm glow of the fire, listening to the wind pound against the walls, and realizing something they had never truly understood before. The man they had mocked for months had built the only place in the valley strong enough to survive the storm. For several minutes, no one moved. The warmth inside the cabin slowly began to seep back into their frozen bodies. Boots dripped melted snow onto the thick wooden floor. Wet coats hung along the wall where Caleb had pointed for them to leave their gear. The fire in the center hearth burned steadily, casting soft orange light across the room. Outside, the storm continued to roar like a freight train tearing through the mountains. Inside, the air felt calm, safe. Caleb stood near the stove, watching everyone carefully. Years in the military had trained him to read a room quickly. He could see exhaustion in their faces, fear in their eyes, and something else beginning to grow beneath it. Relief. He moved quietly across the room and placed a pot of water onto the stove. "We're going to be here a while," he said calmly. Rick looked up. "How long?" Caleb glanced toward the small pressure gauge mounted beside one of the ventilation pipes. 2 days, he said. Then he paused. Maybe 3. The room fell silent. Martha tightened the blankets around the little boy, Mason, who had begun sleeping more peacefully now that the warmth had reached him. 3 days, Rick repeated quietly. Caleb nodded. The storm front is huge, comes down from the Canadian plains, hits the Bitterroot Range, and gets trapped between the valleys. He spoke with the steady tone of someone who had studied storms the way soldiers study battle maps. Wind will keep pushing snow into the valley until the pressure shifts. Ethan looked toward the thick walls. And this place can handle that? Caleb gave a small shrug. That's what I built it for. He walked to a large wooden cabinet and opened it. Inside were shelves filled with supplies, canned food, dried meat, water containers, medical kits, everything organized with quiet precision. Rick stared. You planned for this. Caleb pulled out a stack of bowls and set them on the table. I prepared for it. There was a difference in the way he said the words. Planning sounded like fear. Preparation sounded like discipline. He began ladling warm broth into the bowls. Everyone eats first, he said. The simple instruction carried the calm authority of someone used to leading people through dangerous situations. The group gathered slowly around the table. For many of them, it was the first real warmth they had felt all night. Steam rose from the bowls as they held them in their trembling hands. Martha helped Mason sip a few spoonfuls. Color slowly returned to the boy's cheeks. Across the room, Shadow rested beside the hearth. The German shepherd lay on a folded blanket Caleb had placed beneath him. His injured leg was wrapped tightly, and though he occasionally winced, his eyes remained alert, watching, guarding, even now. Caleb knelt beside him and checked the bandage. You did good tonight, he murmured quietly. Shadow's tail thumped gently against the floor. Rick sat nearby, watching the dog. That animal's tougher than most men I know, he said. Caleb smiled faintly. He had good training. Hours passed. Outside, the storm grew stronger. Snow piled higher against the walls of the cabin, until the lower windows were nearly buried. The wind screamed through the pine trees so violently that the entire forest seemed to groan under the pressure. But inside the cabin, the system Caleb had built continued working exactly as intended. Warm air circulated through hidden vents. Fresh oxygen flowed through the insulated pipes that reached above the snow line. The thick walls held the heat, and slowly, the people of Redpine began to relax. That night, Caleb organized the group the way he once organized soldiers in a remote outpost. "Everyone rests in shifts," he explained. He pointed toward a row of sleeping cots stored along the far wall. "2 people stay awake with me each watch." Rick frowned. "For what?" Caleb nodded toward the door. "Storm like this can collapse roofs or block vents." His eyes moved briefly to the ventilation gauges. "Someone has to keep an eye on things." Ethan volunteered first. Rick followed. The rest of the group settled into the cots, exhaustion finally overcoming their fear. The wind continued its relentless assault outside, hour after hour, through the long mountain night. Sometime before dawn, Ethan stood beside Caleb near the window. The storm had buried almost half the cabin. Only the upper portion of the glass remained visible above the snow. Ethan shook his head slowly. "If we stayed in town—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Caleb knew exactly what he meant. The houses in Redpine had thin roofs, old chimneys, weak insulation. They had been built for normal winters, not for storms like this. Caleb poured another cup of coffee from a small metal kettle. "People build for the winters they remember," he said quietly. Then he looked out into the darkness beyond the glass. "But storms don't care what people remember." Shadow lifted his head from the floor. The dog listened carefully to the wind, just like he used to listen for danger during patrols overseas. Caleb noticed the movement and nodded slightly toward him. "Easy, partner," he said softly. Shadow rested his head back down. For 3 days the storm continued. The wind never truly stopped. Snow kept falling across the valley, burying roads, rooftops, and fields beneath massive white drifts. Inside the cabin, life continued in careful rhythm. People cooked. They talked quietly. They shared stories by the fire. And slowly, the mood inside the room began to change. Fear faded. Respect took its place. Because every person inside that cabin now understood something they hadn't before. The man they once mocked had not been paranoid. He had simply been prepared. And that preparation had saved their lives. On the morning of the 3rd day, the wind finally began to weaken. The roaring outside softened. The trees no longer bent beneath violent gusts. Caleb stepped toward the door and placed his hand against the steel surface. For the first time since the storm began, the cabin felt still. Behind him, the people of Redpine waited quietly. None of them laughed anymore. They simply watched the man who had carried them through the storm, waiting to see what he would do next. Caleb stood quietly for a moment, his hand resting against the steel door. The cabin had been silent for several minutes now. The roar of the blizzard that had battered the mountain for days had faded into something softer. Just a low wind moving through the trees. A different sound. The sound of a storm dying. Caleb turned toward the ventilation gauge on the wall and studied it carefully. The pressure had begun to rise again. A good sign. He nodded once to himself. "It's easing," he said. The words moved through the room like a slow breath being released. Martha hugged the little boy beside her. Rick rubbed his face with both hands, as if trying to wake up from a strange dream. Ethan stepped closer to the door. "So, we made it?" Caleb didn't answer right away. Storms in the mountains had a way of pretending they were finished when they weren't. He unlatched the first lock, then the second. The heavy steel door creaked open a few inches. A thin beam of pale winter light slipped into the cabin. Cold air followed. But it wasn't the violent blast of frozen wind they had felt before. It was calm. Still. Caleb opened the door the rest of the way. The people inside slowly gathered behind him. Outside, the world had changed. The valley below them looked almost unrecognizable. Snow covered everything in thick white layers that stretched across the mountains like a frozen ocean. The roads were gone. Fences had vanished. Even some rooftops in the distance were nearly buried beneath towering drifts. Redpine looked smaller now, quieter, almost fragile. Rick stepped outside first. His boots sank deep into the snow. "Good Lord," he whispered. Martha followed, holding Mason's hand. The little boys stared wide-eyed at the endless snow surrounding them. Ethan walked a few steps forward and turned slowly, taking in the valley. "If we'd stayed in town..." He stopped speaking, because everyone knew the truth. Many of those houses would never have held against the cold for 3 nights. Caleb stepped out beside them. Shadow limped out after him. The German shepherd moved slowly now, but his head remained high, his eyes scanning the quiet mountains the way a soldier studies a battlefield after the fight. Rick looked down at the dog. "You're a hero, you know that?" he said softly. Shadow wagged his tail once. Caleb rested a hand on the dog's neck. He was just doing his job. They stood there together for a long moment. The storm had left the mountains silent. No wind, no movement. Just snow glittering under the pale Montana sun. Finally, Rick turned toward Caleb. The confident bar owner looked different now. Humbled. A little embarrassed. He cleared his throat. "Listen, Caleb." The others looked up. Rick rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "I owe you an apology." Caleb said nothing. Rick looked down at the snow. "Back in town, I made a lot of jokes about this place." He gestured toward the cabin. "Called it a fool's shelter." The words hung in the cold air. Rick lifted his head again. "But the truth is," he shook his head slowly, "you saved every one of us." The others nodded quietly. Martha stepped forward. "If not for this cabin and your dog," her voice softened, "my son might not be here right now." Caleb looked at the boy. Mason smiled shyly and waved. For a moment, Caleb's expression softened. Then he spoke. "People do what they have to do," he said. Rick frowned slightly. "That's it? That's all you're gonna say?" Caleb gave a small shrug. "I built the place." He glanced across the valley. "You showed up." Rick laughed quietly. "You're a strange man, Caleb Walker." Caleb looked down at Shadow. "That's what they tell me." They spent the next several hours digging a narrow path down from the ridge. The snow was deep, sometimes reaching their waists, but the sunlight made the work easier. By late afternoon, they reached the edge of town. The damage was worse than they expected. Several roofs had partially collapsed beneath the heavy snow. Chimneys had cracked. Frozen pipes had burst inside more than one house. But something important had survived.
the people. Every single person who had climbed the ridge that night was alive, because one man had been ready for the storm. By evening, word had spread through the valley. The story traveled quickly between ranches and farms, about the cabin on the ridge, about the man who built it, and about the German shepherd who had led people through the blizzard. For the first time since Caleb Walker had arrived in Redpine, the town spoke his name with respect, not laughter.
And beside him, limping but proud, Shadow walked like the quiet guardian he had always been. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the Bitterroot Mountains. The snow did not disappear overnight. In places, it stayed piled along the roads and fields for weeks, slowly melting beneath the pale Montana sun. Creeks began running again beneath the ice, and the wind carried the faint smell of wet earth through the valley. But Redpine had changed. The storm had left more than just snow behind. It had left a memory. In the weeks that followed, neighbors helped one another repair roofs, clear roads, and dig out barns buried beneath drifts. Tractors moved slowly through town, pushing walls of snow aside as the valley returned to life. And almost every conversation eventually led to the same subject: the cabin on the ridge. People spoke about it with a kind of quiet respect. Some called it the safest building in the county. Others simply called it what it had proven to be: a shelter. Rick Dalton was one of the first to climb the ridge again once the roads cleared. He brought lumber in the back of his truck and spent 2 full days helping Caleb repair part of the outer railing that had been damaged by the storm winds. The work was quiet. Rick wasn't a man used to silence, but something about the ridge made him thoughtful. On the second afternoon, he leaned against the railing and looked out across the valley. "You know," he said, "people in town are talking about building their houses like this now." Caleb glanced over from where he was tightening a bolt. "Like what?" Rick nodded toward the cabin walls. "Thicker insulation, better vents, backup heat." He paused. "Prepared." Caleb returned to his work without much reaction. "That's a good idea." Rick laughed softly. "You really are a strange guy." Shadow lay nearby in the sunlight, his injured legs slowly healing. The bandage had been removed a few days earlier, and though he still favored the paw slightly, the dog moved with the same quiet alertness he always had. Rick watched him for a moment. "Town vet says he'll be fine," Rick added. Caleb scratched behind the dog's ears. "I figured he would." Life returned to normal in Redpine, but it was a different kind of normal. People started preparing. New chimneys were reinforced. Fuel supplies were stored earlier each fall. And several families began building storm shelters modeled after the one Caleb had constructed. Before long, the design had a name: the Walker Shelter System. The name embarrassed Caleb every time he heard it. But the people of Redpine insisted, because they all remembered that night on the ridge. Years passed. Seasons rolled across the valley in their slow Montana rhythm. Summer brought golden fields and long, quiet evenings. Autumn painted the forests in deep reds and amber. Winter returned each year with its familiar cold winds. But never again did the town face a storm quite like the one that had nearly buried them all. Caleb Walker grew older. The strong Navy SEAL who had once hauled lumber up the ridge by himself moved a little slower with time. His beard turned gray, and the lines around his eyes deepened from years of mountain sun and winter wind. But he stayed on the ridge. The cabin remained his home, and Shadow remained at his side. The German shepherd aged with him. The dog's muzzle slowly turned silver, and his once powerful stride became slower. But his eyes stayed the same, calm, intelligent, loyal. The two of them could often be seen sitting together on the cabin porch, watching the valley, watching the storms move across the distant mountains. Years later, when Caleb Walker finally passed away in his sleep one quiet autumn night, the news spread quickly through the Bitterroot Valley. Redpine closed its stores for the day. Farmers left their fields. Families drove up the winding road to the ridge. They gathered beside the cabin Caleb had built with his own hands. Many of them brought their children, because this was a story worth remembering. Rick Dalton, now much older himself, stood near the front of the small crowd. He cleared his throat and spoke quietly. When Caleb first came here, we thought he was crazy. A few people smiled softly. Rick shook his head. Turns out he was the only one who understood the mountains. Beside the cabin, a simple stone marker had been placed beneath a tall pine tree. Caleb Walker, protector of the valley. And next to it stood something else, a small bronze statue, a German shepherd, Shadow. The dog stood in the sculpture exactly as people remembered him, alert, proud, watching the valley below. Rick placed a hand gently on the statue as he passed. "Good dog," he whispered. The wind moved softly through the trees. High above the valley, the cabin on the ridge still stood strong against the mountain sky. And every winter, when the first storms rolled down from the north and the wind began to whisper through the Bitterroot forests, the people of Redpine remembered something Caleb Walker had once told them. People don't prepare because they are afraid. They prepare so they can protect someone else. And maybe that's the real lesson from the ridge above Redpine. Not every hero wears a uniform anymore. Sometimes it's a quiet man who prepares when everyone else laughs. And a loyal dog who never leaves his side. Before you go, I want to ask you something simple. If you believe loyalty like Shadow's still exists in this world, type 1 in the comments. If you think more people should prepare to protect others the way Caleb did, type 0 in the comments. Just a 0 or 1. I read every comment, and I'd love to see what you think. And if this story moved you, take a second to subscribe to the channel, because the next story we share might be even more powerful. Another true kind of hero story about courage, loyalty, and the bond between a veteran and the dog who stands beside him. Until the next story, stay safe out there.